Today I answer the question, my thoughts on what a real life Batman would look like. It's gonna get real. So I'm still in the process of making chapter 3 of my Blade series, and if you haven't checked out chapters 1 and 2, check out the links down below. But in the meantime, let's talk Batman. When you think of Batman, you think of the ultimate human specimen. Strong, fast, powerful, ninja-like agility, and the stamina to go all night fighting crime. But let's stop to ask the sober question. Has Batman's physique really been accurately portrayed in the comic books? As someone who, in the real world, possesses all those physical qualities that he's shown to have in the comic books? To answer that question, you would have to look at some real-world examples of somebody who could actually possess all of those athletic qualities. And athletes like that do exist. Well, maybe not completely, because Batman's shown to do some pretty crazy things. But we can at least use some of these athletes as a model for it. To do that, we need to see who these athletes are and how they're actually built. Now, in the comics, Batman is usually represented to be 6'2" and weigh about 210 pounds. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not small. But if you spend as much time as I have around football players, combat athletes, and strength sport competitors, you draw the same conclusion I have. At that size, Batman would lack the raw strength needed to toss criminals around and grapple with supersized psychos. There's been plenty of people commenting on how many of the way comic book illustrators draw Batman, that it looks more like someone who weighs closer to 250 pounds at 6% body fat, still standing at 6 feet 2 inches. But not only would this be impossible for Batman to maintain, given his grueling level of activity, it would also be trading size and strength for agility and speed. And even if he was able to maintain his power and gymnastic ability at this body weight, he'd for sure be sacrificing his endurance for strength. More muscle increases oxygen demand during physical exertion, because your heart has to pump more blood to supply that tissue. So yeah, he might hit hard, but he wouldn't be sprinting across rooftops or fighting for very long. His stamina would just burn out too fast. There comes a point of diminishing returns when building muscle, and too much muscle would take too much of his energetic resources he'd need to sustain endurance. But still, in my estimation, a real-life Batman would need to be taller and heavier than he's typically depicted. He needs to be somewhere around 6'3" to 6'4", about 235 to 240 pounds, with an ideal body fat percentage for elite performance. Now, despite what you might think, these are not just numbers I pulled out of my ass. My plan is to back it up with supporting evidence of real elite athletes that possess strength, speed, and agility. So let's start by looking at NFL athletes, because despite what you may think of the sport, they are some of the most powerful athletic athletes on the face of the earth. People who haven't seen college and professional football players up close really have no idea what they're actually capable of. Watching them on TV does not do it justice. Now, I have some firsthand experience in witnessing what these athletes are actually capable of. And mind you, this was only at the college level when I was a college strength and conditioning coach. I saw the starting running back on our team hang power clean 365 pounds about 10 times, and that was in a row. You can call me a liar, that's fine. It wouldn't be the first time, but I witnessed it with my own 2 eyes. And I see everything. Now, this guy actually did make it to the NFL, but he wasn't at the top of the freaks that are playing in the NFL. And they're all freaks of nature, mind you. But when talking about football players, I'm specifically going to use NFL linebackers and defensive ends as the model for Batman. Because although they aren't always thought of this way, they are some of the most athletic players on the field. And they're excellent examples of athletes who need to combine brute strength with speed and agility. Usually they're some of the bigger players on the field because they need the brute strength to make big hits and push through defenders. But they can still run incredibly fast, jump ridiculously high, change direction quickly, and have amazing reaction time, hand-eye coordination, and agility. The physical demands of playing in high-intensity conditions for extended periods also mirror the endurance Batman would need for long nights of crime fighting. So let's look at the average body stats of NFL linebackers and defensive ends. The average height and weight for an NFL linebacker is about 6 feet 2 inches and 240 pounds. With 10% body fat. Some top linebackers like Demario Davis at 6'2", 236 pounds, Bobby Wagner at 6 foot, 241 pounds, Khalil Mack at 6'3", 247 pounds, and Micah Parsons at 6'3", 245 pounds, who is an edge rusher, which is kind of like a hybrid between a linebacker and a defensive end, all sit around this average. And as you can plainly see, they all have an incredible amount of muscle on them, with all the strength and power that comes along with that. Yet they still have the dexterity, speed, and coordination that most people half their size don't possess. Now, the average height of an NFL defensive end is definitely higher. They're approximately 6'4", with a range extending from 6'1" to 6'8", indicating that they are generally tall, agile athletes. The average weight of a defensive end is 274 pounds. But this can vary widely depending on the specific role they play, with lighter ends at around 235 pounds and the heaviest pushing 335 pounds. The average body fat percentage of a defensive end typically falls between 12 to 20%. Defensive ends who focus more on agility and speed, similar to edge rushers, tend to be on the leaner side, closer to 12%. Like I said, there's quite a range in height and body weight. But even with the increased size, some of these guys are still freakishly explosive and agile. Just look at this picture of Myles Garrett at the NFL Combine, jumping 41 inches at 272 pounds. That type of vertical jump is mind-blowing, even for a lighter player. But doing it at that body weight is unreal. Plus, just look at what the guy looks like. Then you have Nick Bosa at 6'4", 266 pounds, who has the mobility and agility to do things like this, and quite possibly may have been drawn by comic book artists and released upon the world by an evil wizard. For a real-life Batman to maintain the agility, strength, and athleticism seen in the comics, a physique similar to that between an NFL linebacker and a defensive end, particularly those on the lighter, more agile side of the spectrum, would be ideal. Now, some linebackers, even one or two I put on my list, are actually 6'1" to 6'2", but I still stand by my claim that for a real Batman to stand up to beat the hell out of the giant thugs, and to appear as physically imposing as he'd want to be vengeance, he needs to be somewhere between 6'3" to 6'4". So although I love talking about football, I can't use NFL athletes as the only model for a real-life Batman. He's not just running, jumping, and tackling criminals. He's grappling, punching, kicking, and throwing psychos for hours at a time each night. And that's a different type of physical demand. So obviously we have to look at top professional MMA fighters as another model for Batman. Not to mention we look at the heavyweight division for all the reasons we've already gone over. The weight range for the UFC heavyweight division is 206 to 265 pounds. Now that's a pretty big range, and it doesn't answer the question as to what is the ideal for Batman. So according to my research, it seems that for heavyweight MMA fighters, the ideal weight typically falls between 235 to 245 pounds, especially for athletes who balance power, speed, and endurance. So at this smaller range, fighters maintain enough muscle mass to generate significant power while avoiding excessive weight that might slow them down or negatively impact endurance. Then in terms of height, heavyweight MMA fighters generally range from around 6'2 to 6'4. While fighters shorter or taller than this range can still be successful, this height range allows for a strong balance of reach, power, and agility in a fight. Fighters like John Jones at 6'4", 245 pounds definitely fits into this range and demonstrates that it's possible to maintain elite level agility, striking power, and wrestling ability even at a higher body weight. Once again, the muscular development needed to absorb blows and generate explosive power would be necessary for Batman, who fights gangs of enemies in hand-to-hand combat. Now there's one more question I know at least some of you are dying to ask. Would this bigger Batman really have all the gymnastic, acrobatic, and parkour skills that he needs to do at least some of what you see him do in the comic books? Well, the average parkour athlete typically weighs less than 200 pounds, because being lighter makes fluid movement and hurdling over obstacles easier. But there are some outliers who are quite a bit heavier than this, who regularly do acrobatic flipping. Some of them work as stuntmen, and others like Juji Mufu at 240 pounds, I believe, spend their time doing things like this. Plus, I would argue that if men like this weren't wasting their time making millions of dollars in the NFL, you'd see more bigger men doing parkour on YouTube. So taking all these examples and all these stats, I think the evidence suggests that a real-life Batman, standing around 6'3 to 6'4 and weighing approximately 230 to 240 pounds, with a body fat percentage around 8 to 10%, would maintain both the strength to overpower criminals and the agility to navigate Gotham's rooftops. This body type parallels NFL linebackers and some MMA fighters, while still allowing for flexibility and agility demonstrated by heavier parkour athletes. Now there's two last things to address. The first is a more detailed explanation of why the body fat percentage that I chose, and the second would be genetics. Before I get yelled at by someone who says that Batman should definitely be leaner than 8% body fat, you should understand something about body fat. Having too low a body fat percentage wouldn't really be good for Batman, despite how cool it might seem to be ultra lean for speed and agility. The reality is body fat serves important functions, especially for someone like Batman, who relies on both strength and endurance. First off, fat is an essential energy reserve. With extremely low body fat, Batman would struggle to keep his stamina up during long nights of crime fighting. We already discussed how his body weight actually helps him. But if he's all muscle and no fat, this means a higher oxygen demand, which can make it harder for him to sustain those intense, prolonged activities without running out of steam. So his endurance would take a hit. On top of that, low body fat can increase injury risk. Fat actually does help cushion joints and protect organs. And Batman's high-impact, high-risk movements, like jumping from rooftops or getting into brawls, would put him at a higher risk for joint injuries if his body fat got too low. Not to mention that being too lean can actually mess with hormones and bone density, leading to stress fractures over time. Batman needs strength, but without fat to support joint health, he could get sidelined with injuries. So in short, Batman would need to maintain a healthy balance, probably around 8 to 10% or even 8 to 12% body fat, so he can stay fast, agile, and strong without sacrificing endurance or risking injury. Now as for genetics, some people may see the elite athletes that I decided to include in my argument and grumble that I chose the most gifted athletes as examples, that these are people that won the genetic lottery. Well, I got some news for you. Yes, these athletes are made of something different than 99% of everyone in the world. But here's some more news. So is Batman. Someone who was not only able to take up the mantle of Batman, but continue to be Batman for years and years, would have to be one of the most genetically gifted human beings in the world. And not only physically, but also mentally for that matter. He would be that type of athlete who could build and maintain all that muscle while being able to run fast, jump high, and stay lean. He would be a heavyweight fighter with the right balance of reach, power, and agility. And he would be that genetic outlier who could hurdle, flip, and walk on his hands at 235 to 240 pounds. That's not to say he wouldn't have unyielding discipline and work his ass off. His determination is what would make him Batman, but he'd never get there without the right stuff from mom and dad. And that's just reality. So let me know your thoughts about my assessment about how a real life Batman would have to be built down in the comments. And if you found this interesting, I'd really appreciate if you leave a like and share it. And I'll see you next time they shine my light in the sky.